Let's take a look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate means the total, the collective, the combined. All the markets that we've been looking at so far have been individual supply and individual demand. So what happens to the market for French wines when Sonoma County wines become more popular? Or what happens to the market for automobiles when steel prices start to increase? Okay, now we want to move away from individual markets and look at what's happening to all of the markets collectively in the United States for domestically produced goods and services. So we're going to combine a couple of the chapters that we've been working off of recently, and we're going to look at the price level and real GDP. So what's the relationship between the price level and the amount of real GDP that's produced? Okay, so after studying the price level and inflation and deflation, we know that the easiest thing to do is to look at the price level as an index. So we can say, what's the difference in GDP when the price level is 105 as opposed to when the price level falls to 98? Okay, and down here we're going to have real gross domestic product. So let's go ahead and start on the aggregate demand side. All right, so when the price level is 105, do we expect there to be more gross domestic product or less gross domestic product, or do we think that there's not a relationship between the two? Well, let's start off by looking at two different points of GDP. Let's say that the market can produce $17.5 trillion of real GDP, or $18 trillion of real GDP. Now remember, real GDP is adjusted for inflation, okay? So this isn't our nominal GDP. Our nominal GDP has not been adjusted for inflation. Real GDP means that we are actually having an increase in output, not just that the prices are going up. So the price level is actually the main determinant of spending in the economy. So let's see what happens as the price level increases or decreases. Well, there are three different effects that we're going to look at. The first one is called the wealth effect. Now, the wealth effect looks at what happens to household spending when there's a change in the value of wealth. So let's say that households have some given income, and this is going to be their wealth portfolio. Let's say that they have a wealth portfolio equal to $100,000. Okay, this is their savings, their 401k. This is their wealth. Hopefully, it's larger than $100,000 if they're nearing retirement, but let's say that it's $100,000. So what happens to the value of that wealth, or the perceived value of that wealth, as the price level starts to change? Well, when the price level starts to fall, people can spend the same amount of money as they were spending before and have more goods and services, or they can buy the same amount of goods and services and be able to save money. So as the price level starts to fall, if there's a decrease in the price level, the overall level of goods and services, it's going to cause individuals to feel wealthier. Okay? When households feel wealthier, we see that they increase their quantity demanded of real GDP. Okay? So that means that so far it sounds like that when the price level is starting to decrease, let's say, as the price level starts to come down, it's going to cause households to increase their quantity demanded of real GDP, okay? So let's see if that holds by looking at another effect, okay? Now let's look at the next one that's very easy is called the international trade effect. Okay, so let's look at what happens internationally as our price level starts to fall. We only accept payment for domestically produced goods and services in US dollars. So if China wants to buy American goods, if Belgium wants to buy American goods, if England wants to buy American goods, they have to change their domestic currency into US dollars. So their spending is going to be based on our United States price level. Of course, it's going to have the interest rate is going to, or I'm sorry, the exchange rate is going to play a role here, but we're not going to cover that for a couple more chapters. So right now, let's just assume the exchange rate is some constant number, and we're not going to have any exchange rate fluctuations. So what happens when the price level falls domestically? Let's say that our price level is going down and their international price level is staying the same, whether it's the UK or Belgium or Canada. Let's see what happens. Well, as our price level starts to go down, our goods are relatively cheaper than their domestically produced goods and services. So that means the amount of goods and services that they are buying for the United States, our exports start to increase. Okay, so again, we're proving this relationship that as the price level falls, there's going to be an increase in real GDP. Okay, so over here we can say that the decrease in the price level can cause an increase in U.S. exports. So the quantity demanded of U.S. exports. Okay, so it's not an increase in the overall demand. The only reason that the quantity demanded is going up is because the price level is going down. So again, it sounds like that when price level is high, we're going to have a high price level corresponding with a low level of GDP, and then as the price level increases, that real GDP, the quantity demanded of real GDP, is going to increase. I'm not going to draw that point yet until we are absolutely sure that that is, in fact, the slope of the aggregate demand curve. So the first effect that shows us what the slope of the aggregate demand curve is the wealth effect. This one's pretty easy. If the wealth effect holds, there's definitely going to be a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. The next one is the international trade effect. Well, I've just proven that as the price level falls in the United States relative to that of the rest of the world, we will have an increase in the quantity demanded of United States produced real GDP. So now let's go ahead and get rid of this stuff over here, and let me Okay, so let me go ahead and get rid of that, and let's go ahead and look at the third reason that the aggregate demand curve is in fact downward sloping. And this one is probably the most interesting of the three, okay? So the third reason is what we call the interest rate effect. Okay, so now this one is a little bit more detailed. We're going to take three individuals. We're going to take Sarah, Steve, and Sam. Okay. Now let's say that Sarah, Steve, and Sam all make $1,000 a month. Okay, so, and let's say that they're all roommates. Okay, so they each have the exact same income. Now, part of that income is going to pay their rent, part of that income is going to pay for their groceries. And let's say that at the end of the month, let's look at their expenses. Okay, so the expensive for Sarah, well, her parents taught her to spend, to put 10% of her income away every month. So her expenses are going to be $900. Okay, Steve didn't learn that valuable lesson, and he spends his entire paycheck. He's literally living paycheck to paycheck. Now, Sam, on the other hand, at the end of the month, Sam pretty much always overspends. He puts a little bit of gas on the credit card, or he puts a night of going out on the credit card, and pretty much consistently he spends $1,100. Okay, so at the end of the month, if we were to look at their savings, we would see that Sarah has $100 in savings. Steve has no savings, and Sam's savings are in fact negative. He has negative $100. Okay, so now let's look at a separate market. We're going to look at the loanable funds market. Okay, and we're going to come down here and I'll do it down here. We're going to look at the loanable funds market. Now, let's say that this market is going to start off in equilibrium. So this is going to be the interest rates, and this is going to be the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, so this is not a market that is regulated in terms of the interest rate. It is market forces are going to determine the interest rate. So it is supply and demand that are going to determine the interest rate. So let's have our demand curve and let's have our supply curve for loans. Okay, so this is going to be the supply, this is going to be the supply of loanable funds, and this is going to be the demand of loanable funds. Okay, and this market starts off in equilibrium. All right, so we see that the market starts off in equilibrium. Okay, and let's say that the interest rate happens to be 3%. Okay, and there's some quantity, we'll call it Q star, that's going to be for the supply and demand in equilibrium. Okay, so at a 3% interest rate, the market's in equilibrium. Now let's see what happens to the interest rate market when there is a reduction in the price level. So let's say that Sam, Steve, and Sarah all are going to buy the exact same goods and services, however the price level falls, okay? So instead of their expenditures being $900, let's say for simplicity that we're going to take $100 off of that for each person, okay? So that means that when we look at the savings for each person, the savings are going to grow by $100. So that means that for Sarah, her savings are going to be $200 a month. Steve's finally going to have some savings. He's going to be saving $100 a month, and Sam is going to be breaking even. Okay. So what happens collectively to the supply and demand of loanable funds? Well, we're going to see that Sarah and Steve, Sarah was already adding to the supply of loanable funds. Now she's adding more. Steve wasn't adding anything before, but he's finally adding to the loanable to the supply of loanable funds. So we're going to see that there is going to be an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Okay, so there's going to be an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Okay, so the curve is going to shift to the right. Now, what happened to the people like Sam, who at the end of every month were having to borrow money from the loanable funds market? Well, they are no longer going to have to be borrowing as much as they used to borrow. So they are going to be able to decrease their demand for loanable funds. So across the board, we're going to see that there is going to be an increase. There's going to be an increase in the supply of loanable funds, and at the same time, there's going to be a reduction in the demand for loanable funds. Okay, so what happens to the interest rate for loanable funds? Well, now let's say that the interest rate has fallen to somewhere around 1%. Okay, so we had to use all of this to explain what's going on with the price level when there's a reduction, or when there's a reduction in the price level. How does this affect GDP? And we're using it, and we're looking at the interest rate market to explain this. So Sarah, Steve, and Sam now are able to increase the supply of loanable funds and decrease the demand for loanable funds, which caused the price of borrowing money to fall. That's what the interest rate is. It's the cost of borrowing money. So when the interest rate falls, that means that more consumers are going to be borrowing money. Eventually, we'll see that there's an increase in demand, and we'll see that that over time, these interest rates will start to come back up. But as the interest rates fall, it causes households to finally go out and buy that second car. It causes people that have been renting for a long time to possibly look at moving into a home. But the big one is that when the price of a loan falls, firms who need million, $3 million, $5 million loans, the change in the cost for them is very significant. So we see that the reduction in the interest rate increases spending across the board. So now we can bring these two curves together, and we can say that when there is a reduction in the interest rate, a reduction in the price level, it definitely causes an increase in real GDP. So we're going to call this curve our aggregate demand curve. Okay, this is our aggregate demand curve. Okay, in the next video, we're going to look at what causes our aggregate demand curve to increase and to shift to the right, or to decrease and to shift to the left.